It's a great honor having the chance to share with you the results of our research. But before I do that, let me share something terrible that happened to me in 2013 when I lost my imagination and my creative spark. And obviously I was very concerned. And no matter how hard I tried, for instance, I tried to look at the possible applications of this wonderful new material called graphene. As you might know, graphene is something that scientists have been studying for decades and finally have been able to manage. And graphene is actually a very thin layer made of carbon atoms. It's 100 times stronger than steel, and still it can be bended. It conducts efficiently electricity and heat. And I was very inspired by the idea of exploring these opportunities, and I tried to engage people in this discussion. But being 2013, whenever I tried to talk to somebody, it seemed everybody was inspired by the Gamma style. But then everything changed, not because we found out that 85% of participants to our study consider innovation a strategic priority. That was hardly surprising if we consider that in today's business landscape, more and more industries are in a structural condition where supply exceeds demands. And to stand out in so crowded marketplaces, innovation is an imperative. And also if we consider the pace of change that is constantly increasing, and even global renowned companies like Nokia, BlackBerry, or Sony have in the last few years fallen from a leadership position to a situation of crisis. What we found very inspiring is that only 52% of the respondents to our research are satisfied with their return on their innovation initiatives. And we were quite seriously hit by this finding, because if innovation is so important for this company, there is a huge opportunity. And therefore, we start to explore the reasons why companies are not really fully capturing the opportunity of innovation. And we started by looking at the capacity of organization to come up with new ideas. And we found that only 49% of the respondents to our study are satisfied with the capacity to come up with new ideas. So we found an interesting hint or where the opportunity may lie. And therefore we ask, is the existence of a systematic ideation process key to success when it comes to ideation? And by a systematic process, we mean a process with clearly defined activities, roles and responsibilities, and supporting tools. And what we found is pretty interesting. In fact, when a systematic ideation process is not in place, only 39% of respondents are satisfied with the capacity of the organization to come up with novel ideas. But that level of satisfaction jumps to 65% if systematic processes are in place. However, when we look at the portion of companies that apply the systematic processes, only 34% apply systematic processes, which means 2/3 of companies do not really apply any defined process when it comes to ideation. And therefore, we might have a reason why we're not really capturing the innovation opportunity. And when we dug a little bit more in depth, we found that the most utilized ideation technique is brainstorming. 25% of all innovation initiatives of the respondents to our study have developed their ideas through brainstorming. And the least used technique instead is external co-creation, often named as open innovation, which is the technique we use when we give our customers or suppliers or business partners a chance to join our efforts to come up with new ideas and drive innovation. Then we look at the possible additional reason of such disappointing results when it comes to ideation. And we ask ourselves, is the involvement of staff key for effective ideation? And what we found is that if only the top senior management is involved, only 30% of respondents are satisfied with the capacity of the organization to come up with innovative ideas. That level of satisfaction jumps to 50 if a broader number of individuals is given such opportunity, and to 54 if everybody in the organization is allowed to suggest new ideas. In this case, companies are not really doing that bad. Only 20% rely just on top senior management for new ideas, while a bigger number allow a broader number of employees to support the ideation efforts. And last, we look at training. And what we found is very interesting. Only 30% are satisfied when no training is provided. 50% when training is provided, but not really systematically, which means once in a while, not really well developed according to the career paths, and 75% when instead training is provided systematically. We were not actually surprised by these findings because research shows that ideation and creativity is very different from logical thinking. Ideation is based on the EQ, on our emotional skills, instead of IQ, our intelligence. And while intelligence seems to be strictly related to our genetic traits, emotional skills can be developed. This has been demonstrated by researchers that have studied identical twins, which means they have studied twins at a given point in life, and they have measured both the EQ and the IQ. And whereas the IQ was still similar, although these individuals have gone through different experiences in life, which means that strictly relates to their genetic traits, the EQ was radically different. But instead, we were quite surprised when we found the behavior of companies. 39%, let me say again, an astonishing 39% do not provide any ideation, creativity, and innovation training to their staff. Half of them provide some training, and only 10% of companies provide systematic training on ideation. And then in the study, we move beyond ideation. And to introduce the next part of the study, I'd like to show you a picture and ask you a question. This is an Apple camera produced by Apple, one of the most renowned innovative companies. So let me ask you, has anyone in the room ever owned an Apple camera? Please raise your hand. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think we are around 0.8%. What about the Apple Pippin, the video game console produced by Apple? Okay, this one is 2 individuals, which means 0.4% approximately. What about the last one? The first Apple tablet, the Apple Newton, So we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 0.8 point%. How is it possible that Apple, such a respected, successful company, has launched in the past products that have not been able to achieve a market share over, or a penetration over 1%? So the point I'm making is that conventional wisdom relies on an innovation process that obviously requires ideation. We all believe that in order to come up with successful innovations, we have to be able to develop novel, solid, insightful ideas. And then we tend to believe that, obviously, we need to execute them well. Everything is execution, execution, execution. But the reason why I showed you those Apple products is that in reality, even successful innovators make mistakes. And the reason why they mistake is that very unlikely our best ideas are going to be ready to be executed. Even an idea which is very good and properly defined at it, let's say 95%, will require an additional 5% of fine-tuning in order to reach commercial success. And in order to reach commercial success and get it right 100%, we need to consider in our innovation process a step which is called development. Therefore, in the study, we decided to devote some time to the development phase. And first of all, we asked to our participants how satisfied they were with the capacity of the organization to develop their ideas into successful commercial opportunities. And what we found is very interesting, as the share of satisfied respondents doesn't really change much. We had a 49% share in the case of ideation that goes to 55% in the case of development. And therefore, we try to follow a similar approach to ideation and look for the relevance of a systematic development process. And what we found is that if a systematic development process is in place, 72% of respondents are satisfied with the capacity of the company to come up with innovation opportunities, while only 43% is the number of respondents satisfied if a systematic development process is not in place. Similarly to the case before, although only 31% of companies have a systematic development in place. So there's a huge opportunity for 7 out of 10 companies to come up with a more structured development process and increase their chances of success from 40% to 70%. So if a systematic development process is key, how should it look like? More in detail, we should have an incubation phase when we take our broad high-level idea and we turn it into a more solid, well-defined concept. A concept is a developed idea that has the potential to become a successful commercial opportunity. And then we need to manage a validation phase when we take our concept and through market testing, prototyping, pilot projects, we take our preliminary business model and we make sure everything is right before we execute it in order to minimize risk while increasing the chances of success. And the interesting thing is that contrary to traditional wisdom, development is a very delicate phase. Because when it comes to development, we need to work hard to make sure we develop properly our ideas. In particular, we need to make sure during development, adequate resources, be it financial resources or managerial resources, are used to properly develop our ideas. But unfortunately, what evidence shows is that because development is competing for the same resources that our current operations are using, they tend to be neglected. The best managers, financial resources, tend to be used to manage the burning issues we face on a daily basis in running our operations. And what is therefore very important is to make sure senior management provides adequate support to our innovations during the development phase. So we ask themselves, is senior management involvement really important during the development? And what we found out, first of all, is that senior top management is basically always involved when it comes to ideation. But the level of involvement of senior and top management is only 2/3 of the cases when it comes to development, which is not really that bad. But if we look at the level of satisfaction with the development process when senior management is involved and when senior management is not involved, we see that if senior management is not involved, the level of satisfaction is just 35%, while it's 57% when senior management is involved. So the lesson learned here is that although majority of companies are doing a good job, the ones that might be struggling during the development phase should be looking at the involvement of the senior management. And if the senior management is not involved, that could be a quick win in order to boost the chances to come up with better, ready-to-be-executed innovations. I'm introducing now the last part of a survey, which is a part where we decided to analyze the blockers of innovation, which is a topic often discussed. And we decided to use a framework that we developed at ECSI Consulting, and it's called the hidden enemies of innovation. Because according to our research, we found that not only poorly run businesses can create innovation blockers, but actually also well-managed companies can unconsciously create environments that are not conducive to innovation. And the reason why they can create unconsciously innovation blockers is that by simply using modern management techniques, they might be creating those innovation enemies. And the reason is that the management techniques that we're using were created, most of them between the 70s and the 80s of last century, when business priorities were quite different from today's priorities. In the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s, priorities were efficiency and controlling the use of resources. While, as we discussed before, today priorities are innovation, adaptation, and change. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to change management techniques that we taught at business schools, because scholars and academics need to gather empirical evidence. They need to formulate assumptions and hypotheses. Then they need to test them, come up with models, and then they are spread in the academic community. And therefore, the slow timing which is required to adapt our management technique may affect the kind of methodologies that we use. And this may result in a number of innovation blockers. So we submitted these hidden enemies to the participants to the study. And what we got is that 60% of the respondents declare that those hidden enemies are relevant in their organization. Only 21% said instead they are absolutely not relevant, with 19% somewhere in between. So we were very curious to see if these hidden enemies are actually harming the efforts of organizations when it comes to innovation. And the results were quite interesting, as when innovation blockers are relevant, only 47% of respondents are satisfied with the overall return on innovation. But this level of satisfaction goes up to 67% when the blockers are not really there. Nearly 50% more chances to be satisfied with your innovation efforts if innovation blockers are not there. So I'd like to spend the last 5 minutes in my presentation sharing with you the blockers that we used in the study. The first group of blockers is what we call the strategic and external analysis, because companies often tend to consider defined the customers, the competitors of the business. And when that happens, they end up fighting head-to-head with the competitors to grab a greater share of an existing market. And this approach is normally nurtured by the use of some traditional techniques, such as excessive customer segmentation or extensive benchmarking to close the gap with our competitors. But the more we close the gap with our competitors, the more we end up looking like them. And whenever we propose an idea that instead drives us in a different direction, we're not really willing to consider it. The second group of hidden enemies is what we call resource allocation processes, because there's a number of blockers that deal with this area. In particular, to mention the most important, very often when we are evaluating different innovation projects, we require a clearly defined return on our innovation project. Whatever the measure, be it the discounted cash flow, the NPV, or the IRR, we want to know how much we're going to get out of it. Unfortunately, very often, good innovation ideas can lead to the creation of markets that cannot be quantified. And when that is the case, good ideas may not pass the cut. Let me share a brief story with you to give you a practical feeling. Set in the 70s, last century, when the American telco giant AT&T was doing its scenarios for long-term strategic planning. And they hired a well-renowned global research company. And they asked this company, how big is going to be the mobile phone industry in year 2000? And can you guess what was the answer? Few thousand devices, correct? Because in those days, mobile phones were very different. Actually, they were not very mobile. They looked like suitcases. They were very heavy and extremely expensive. So expensive that only corporate leaders and prime ministers could afford them. So we cannot really blame that company that estimated only a few mobile thousand devices were sold. And because of that estimate, AT&T decided not to pursue the opportunity. But as we know, in year 2000, few thousand mobile devices were sold in a matter of seconds. And unfortunately, none of them was manufactured by AT&T. The third group is what we call the internally oriented organizations, because in order to create efficient organizations, we follow the principle of organizational design. And we create organizations where we have business units or division and functions that pursue our business opportunities. Unfortunately, several innovation ideas may fall across such organizational structure. And when that happens, very often, such organizational entities can push back good innovation ideas. An interesting example is the case of Nespresso, the coffee system manufactured by Nestle. Although now it's a big product, employing over 7,000 individuals, over 20% of the global coffee market, initially it struggled. It was actually patented in 1974, but for 15 years it struggled. In the first phase, because the company was targeting households, and in those days the purchasing intention was well below the minimum required to find the company. So in the very early days of the project, the issue related with the resource allocation blockers. But as soon as they decided to move the target from households to corporate buyers, none of the existing divisions was willing to take ownership of the project because it didn't really fit well to the existing structure designed to pursue a number of mass markets until they decided to create an ad hoc unit under the direct supervision of a top manager. The last group is what we call the incumbent culture and business model that deals with the way our brain works and how, in particular, it works when we've been operating successfully in a given industry for a number of years. What happens is that we can find ourselves in the capabilities trap because individuals tend to replicate what they already know and master, or the comfort zone, which is an anxiety-neutral behavioral state where we operate without a sense of risk, pushing back any possible initiative that drives change. Or when we take for granted the structure of our industry. And let me give you a brief example through a story set in the same period, the 70s, when all those techniques were created. We still in the US, but in a different industry. We now in the car industry, when Ford was basically attacked by the Japanese car makers in its own market because there was a major fuel crisis in those days. And the Japanese car makers had been developing much smaller, fuel-efficient cars. And they decided to launch in the American market those cars when there was this major fuel crisis. And for the first time, American consumers were willing to give up their old, huge, comfortable, fashionable cars to buy these much smaller, less fashionable, but fuel-efficient vehicles. And Ford was caught by surprise. Directors of the board were shocked by this rapid change in the market. So they decided to react by expanding abroad. It may sound kind of funny today, but 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the world was not so globalized. And creating a foreign branch was a major strategic move. So Ford basically picked 3 very young and promising managers and sent them to the UK to create the first foreign branch of Ford. And they gave them 3 years to establish the business. Can you guess what was the market share that Ford was able to achieve in the UK in 3 years' time? Any guess? 30%. Any other guess? 50, 90. The winner is 0.4%. This is a true story. Obviously, these directors of the board were shocked and they didn't know what to do. So they decided to call in a local consultant, local from the UK, in order to understand what was going on. And this guy decided to conduct 3 months of analysis and go back to Detroit and provide findings and recommendations. And he then, after 3 months, went to Detroit, standing before the board of directors of Ford. He said he had to share 2 pieces of good news, 2 pieces of bad news, and a final recommendation. So the first piece of good news was that the UK was an attractive market. So these directors were pleased they picked the right market, as the first assumption was the market was not a good one. The second piece of good news was that Ford cars were good quality cars. And so the atmosphere was very relaxed. They picked the right market. They manufactured the right cars. What could go wrong? Unfortunately, the first piece of bad news was that not only Ford was manufacturing good cars, but also its competitors. And so these directors start to look at each other, not really that relaxed anymore. And unfortunately, the second piece of bad news came. And that was that those competitors not only were manufacturing good cars, but they were selling them for cheap. Can you believe it? The atmosphere was electric again. But then was time for the recommendation, and they were eager to listen, hoping to find a way out of this critical situation. And then was time for this recommendation. And what the consultant said was to acquire a British business called National Car Park. This business owned 70% of the urban car park spaces in the UK. So let's try to put ourselves in the shoes or in the mind of this consultant. What can you do if you are a car maker trying to entering a foreign market and you acquire a car park business owning 70% of the urban car park spaces in that country? Any idea? What can you do? Discount for the parking, right? So if you own a Ford car, parking for you is going to be extremely cheap. For all the other car owners, extremely expensive. And if you want to be even more aggressive, it's going to be free for Ford owners and forbidden eventually for all the others. What a strong value proposition, isn't it? What else can you do? If you own a car business and you want to enter a foreign market, provide better loan facilities. Yes, you use the car parks as a collateral, you get a lot of money from the banks, and you provide loans. Absolutely. What else? Service. What about car wash or maintenance? So when you go to the mall, you leave your car, and when you get back, your car is shining and beautiful, and they fix all the levels. In reality, although there are so many things you can do, the idea behind this recommendation was slightly different. The idea was that when you buy a car, you go through a complex process. It's not like buying a snack at the 7-Eleven that you buy at the counter without thinking too much. When you buy a car, typically you need to make a down payment, and then you need to pay installments for a number of years. So typically you need to talk to your spouse, you need to evaluate the different models. It's quite a complex purchasing decision, right? So the idea was that the British consumers were not buying Ford cars because they didn't know them. They didn't really feel comfortable in buying them. And by acquiring a car park business, Ford could set up a rental car business, because when we rent cars, our mindset is radically different. We don't want to rent a car we already own or know. We take that opportunity to rent a different car. It's going to be more exciting, right? So the idea was that eventually British consumers would start to rent Ford cars. And after renting them for a while, they would realize Ford cars were good cars. And over time, they would eventually start to buy them. Does it make sense? It does, right? But you know what happened when this consultant made this recommendation to the directors of the board at Ford? This is a true story. Can you guess what happened? They kick him out, literally. What the hell are you talking about? We are Ford. We are the creators of the cars. And you dare to come here and tell us to buy a car park business. Get lost. By the way, can you guess who was the consultant that provided such recommendation? His name is Professor Edward De Bono. It's a story shared. The most respected professor, creator of lateral thinking, and so many bright ideas. But those guys, after 70 years of successful business, were stuck in the common beliefs and implicit assumptions of who we are. What is the nature of our business? We're not willing to consider anything else. So to close my presentation, I would like to summarize the key findings with you. First one, what we found that innovation is considered a priority, but execution falls short, at least for half of the participants in our study. Second, lack of systematic processes affect results, at least for 2/3 of the participants in the study. And ideation techniques are not really fully utilized. So I'm glad, I'm sure in the rest of the day we will hear more about possible, more productive ideation techniques. Staff training participation are key to an effective idea generation. Senior management involvement during development is highly encouraged in order to maximize the chances to turn good ideas into commercially successful products. And last, innovation and hidden enemies are the real hindrance to innovation efforts. I would like to thank all the participants in our study. You have the full report before you on your desks. I would like to thank all of you for your time and attention, and I would like to invite you, if you have time, you're interested, to take part in the new version of the study that is going to be focused on Malaysia. This is the address where you can find the survey. It's already open. I'm afraid if you didn't attend a conference to boost your memory in the last few days, you won't be able to recall this address. So you're very welcome to use your phones and take a picture so that eventually you can recall it and, if you like, to share it with your friend. Once again, thanks again.